The struggle of light versus dark as the personification of good and evil is nearly as old as storytelling itself. As such, these tropes can sometimes reduce a potentially mature story into overly simplistic symbolism.
Two players, two sides. One is light, one is dark.
But beyond a simple battle of ethics, light versus dark can be used to explore the depths of our fears. It can expose the darkness within, ready to consume us when we're faced with temptation. It can serve as a chessboard on which brilliant minds engage in a game of intellectual superiority. Stories of light versus dark can also be used to explore the ultimate fear, a fear of something we cannot fully comprehend with our limited minds. The existential dread that someday our bodies will die and our minds may cease to exist. Nearly every culture on our planet has inherited some form of afterlife myth and/or religion from their ancestors. Our evolutionary drive compels us to avoid death at all costs, but at some point we must all reconcile our own mortality, now more than ever. We've socially and technologically evolved so far that we outlive what nature intended for us. Most animals, including our ancestors, died long before the average lifespans of today, due to predators, untreated diseases, and a total lack of dentists.
You might even try smiling.
Now that we've solved so many of life's conflicts, we're left to stew on our place in the universe and ask the big questions.
So what do you think happens when we die?
Speaking for myself?
Speaking for yourself.
When pondering death and the great beyond, some humans are content with the thought that our minds may simply return to a state of non-existence that they occupied for all of history before being born. Others require comforting tales of life continuing through more spiritual means, such as reincarnation or heaven. Some explore their ideas through their art. For the creators of Final Fantasy VII, these ideas permeated the narrative undertones of their 1997 video game, and decades later, when they revisited the story, these thematic concepts were brought front and center. It may be a story about ecological responsibility, corporate greed, weird robot cat dolls, and waifu love triangles, but at its core, this is a story about finding optimism and tranquility in the cycle of life and death. Or, in the game's own language, it's about finding the promised land. Back in April 2020, I spent much of my time wondering what the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake was building towards. Its final moments featured the characters receiving visions of events from the finale of the original game out of context. Their reaction to this was to make it their mission to defy destiny and prevent the events of the game we were promised a 3-part remake to from ever happening. But more importantly, I feared that the narrative themes of the original story were being completely inverted. Instead of a story of accepting loss, it seemed to suggest we'd instead get a story about fighting to change fate, which could possibly lead to the complete removal of the big character death yet to come. Now, 4 years later, I realized those fears were unnecessary. Although I have my gripes with the way the ending of Remake was presented, the events that unfolded in Rebirth cemented the fact that the writers are keenly in tune with what made Final Fantasy VII's story so special. Not only is it following the same narrative themes, but it is greatly embellishing upon them. The metaphysical tug-of-war between light and dark as a stand-in for the battle between grief and tranquility permeates the narrative of Rebirth very deeply. Although it introduces multiple timelines and other new material, it's all done through a very spiritual lens that almost certainly has a direct connection to the life stream itself, rather than hard sci-fi concepts like time travel or literal multiverses.
Welcome to the Time Variance Authority.
In fact, the way these elements are used are so spiritual that I speculate they may serve the ultimate purpose to tie directly into the ideas of the Promised Land that will be further delved into during Part 3. Characterization plays a large part in how the story of FF7 and its recreation explore coming to terms with mortality. Almost every major character in the story struggles with some form of extreme threat to their mental sanity relating to death, whether the source be external or internal. Characters like Barret and Tifa have the clearest external conflict with death. It seems at every turn their friends and family are ripped away from them by the story's various antagonists.
I'm sick of all of this!
Barret and Tifa represent opposite ends of the revenge spectrum and yet share a similarly parental drive. Barrett's violent motivation to purge Shinra from the world is calmed only by his love for his adopted daughter, while it's Tifa's sky-high sympathy for her friends that stops her from even tiptoeing into the dirty waters of rage Barrett occupies. Together, they represent the father and mother roles in the group, rash and meandering on their own, but excelling within a pseudo-family dynamic. And yet, despite their synergized confidence, the death that encompasses their pasts cannot be stifled forever. Despite strong connections to the themes of death and loss, Barrett and Tifa's drive is less about their relationship to the Reaper and more about how far they'll go to protect those they love from meeting him before their time. In Rebirth, Tifa specifically gets a big boost regarding her connection to death. She goes on a literal and spiritual journey into the life stream where she recollects emotional moments from her life and even begins to accept death's embrace. Our expectations are played with in this scene too, causing us to question whether Tifa could end up being the martyr of the remake series instead of Aerith, especially with how this sequence was shown in trailers. During this scene, we also see white and black manifestations of the Lifestream's power fighting with each other, presumably representing, both literally and figuratively, the conflict between Aerith and Sephiroth over the Lifestream itself. A war of values, hope versus emptiness. Sephiroth is a villain whose present characterization has been shaped by the public perception over the past few decades. His motivations and actions in the original game were very bare bones, as was a lot of the storytelling. Over the years, he's been given embellished traits through dev-adapted fan discourse, extended canon material, and the natural evolution of an iconic legacy. He now sports a single black wing, relies on suffering as a sort of power source, and is partially driven by the fear of death. Although it's not thrown in our faces, much of Sephiroth's actions serve the ultimate purpose of avoiding humanity's ultimate curse, knowing that the Reaper is coming for all of us.
But I will not end. Nor will I have you end.
When you combine that fear with the knowledge that your DNA shares ancestry with an eldritch abomination from deep space, whose sole purpose is to consume worlds for survival, Sephiroth's unhinged motivations aren't all that far-fetched. His one remaining sympathetic character trait seems to be his odd infatuation with Cloud, something that was more or less missing from the original story. His desire to take Cloud under his wing almost comes across as his last remaining drop of humanity. Maybe after all his talk of reducing the world to entropy, he doesn't actually want his eternal life to be spent alone. Cloud was always a character that operated in the periphery of death's grasp. The cellular degradation all soldiers suffer from drifts into his subconscious more deeply as the story unfolds, making him the prime representation of humankind's internal conflict with mortality.
I think that's what's happening to me. That I'm falling apart.
Specifically in Rebirth, this element is greatly expanded upon. As Sephiroth begins to take hold of Cloud's mind, he fears losing himself before he's even truly reached adulthood. As he loses more and more control over his mental faculties, life's appeal begins to lose its shimmer. In the original story, and presumably part 3 of the remake series, he comes close to being lost forever, but is saved thanks to Tifa's love for him, which allows her to reach beyond the metaphysical veil and show him his worth. Of course, Cloud's true encounter with mortality comes from the loss of Aerith. Of all the story changes in Remake and Rebirth, Cloud's reaction to Aerith's death is undeniably the most controversial, and may end up being the most prolific talking point of the trilogy for years to come. Regardless of what answers we eventually get about the timeline events of the sequence, one thing is crystal clear. We were shown Aerith's death from Cloud's unreliable point of view. This sequence has now become ground zero for Cloud's fractured mind. Whether timelines or whispers are interfering here is irrelevant. The core idea conveyed here is that Cloud's mind is not strong enough to cope with the trauma of losing somebody close to him. It happened when Zack died 5 years prior, and now it's happening again with someone to whom he shares an even stronger emotional bond. Possibly even a borderline girlfriend, depending on your choices in the game. This is the moment the core theme of accepting loss takes center stage in a way it never did in the original game. Back then, Cloud accepted that Aerith was gone just moments after her death, then buried her in a lake and went back to hunting Sephiroth. Now that the bare-bones writing of the OG has been embellished so heavily, I actually don't think letting those classic moments play out exactly as they did before would have been consistent with where Cloud's head is at in this part of the story. Despite the few critiques on editing and tonal control I have, I think this sets up a part 3 that has the chance to hammer home Aerith's death as a much bigger emotional moment than it would have been at the end of Rebirth. After all, this is a story about learning to accept loss, and instantly getting closure when someone dies would directly contradict that journey. This time, we'll get all that emotional closure during Cloud's moment of acceptance rather than during his moment of shock. Plus, it's a way to keep Aerith's presence alive for much longer, which I think is needed when the original 35-hour story is spread across hundreds of hours of gameplay, released across almost a decade. It would be nice if there weren't going to be 3 to 4 years between the death and the acceptance, but once Part 3 is out, that's not a complaint that will stand the test of time. Ultimately, we'll look back on a trilogy that ended Act 2 with great loss, and then slowly had its heroes put in the work to learn to grieve as they sprinted into the climax with all the catharsis in the world. And speaking of catharsis, if you're watching this video, chances are you've wondered plenty of times what the ultimate goal of the Re-trilogy's multiple timelines is. There's of course been plenty of online discourse about whether these timelines are multiverses, dreams, livestream experiences, or something else. And considering Sephiroth called them worlds and Aerith called one of them a dream, it's understandable that we'd be a little confused. I'm not here to set the record straight on what the timelines actually are in practicality, but what I would like to do is point out some consistencies I've noticed in how these sequences have been presented and how they tie into the themes of death and pessimism, life and optimism, and the Promised Land. Aerith's role in the remake series has possibly been spiritually deepened more than anyone else. Of course, she was always the last living Cetra holding a connection to the planet no human ever could. After her premature death at the hand of Sephiroth, she mostly faded into memory, though she was ultimately responsible for saving the planet from the livestream after her death. This event was a bit vague and left much up to interpretation. In the Re-trilogy, the foreshadowing of Aerith's death is extremely prominent. Multiple times throughout, characters make reference to her impending doom and how Cloud needs to save her.
But whatever happens, you can't fall in love with me.
It's so self-aware that I think it's fair to say the overall story of the remake project is a story about Final Fantasy VII almost as much as it's about accepting loss or environmentalism. From a macro scale, Aerith's new role transcends space and time. In Remake, she at the very least had some very strong premonitions about her fate, and then in Rebirth, lost most of that knowledge. It's heavily implied that certain appearances of Aerith in Rebirth are an omnipresent version of her, somehow detached from the current reality, fighting for the survival of her friends who will outlive her, and the survival of the planet. In Remake's finale, Omni-Aerith, as Maximilian Dood has dubbed her, somehow purified Sephiroth's portal, which some speculate created the timeline where Zack lives. But as we see in Rebirth, Zack's world is far from an embodiment of light or hope. In this world, everyone in Sector 5 seems to have accepted that the world is ending. This knowledge fills them with depression, dread, and profound meaninglessness.
This is so messed up. All of it.
Zack, ever the optimist, fights against this interlude of death and nihilism, seemingly succeeding, though we'll have to wait for Part 3 to see how his story pans out. In stark contrast to Zack's world, the final chapter of Rebirth sees Aerith somehow pull Cloud into a world where everything is how we wish it could be. The world is ending here too, and the citizens of Sector 5 have accepted their fate, but in a way that frees them to seek joy and pleasure in the brief moments they have left.
Let's just call it a dream. My dream, to be precise.
This interlude of life and optimism gives us a glimpse into what could have been, if only life wasn't so cruel. Cloud and Aerith go on one last date. Cloud smiles a few times, and at long last we see these two being truly happy together, even if it's only wishful thinking. After Aerith's final moments of peace and joy come to an end, she says goodbye to Cloud, knowing full well what fate awaits her. The sequence is one of the most emotionally impactful and gut-wrenching scenes of the story, partially due to the incredible score, which reminded me so much of that one track from Toy Story 3.
So long, partner.
To me, these two interludes, the world of nihilism and the world of optimism, represent the two states our minds may occupy when we contemplate leaving the world of the living behind. And this isn't an idea new to Final Fantasy VII, as it holds an extremely close connection to the philosophies of the Promised Land. In the original FF7, the Promised Land played a fairly minor role, a lot of which was found in the subtext and left up to interpretation. The Promised Land was first explained as an actual location on the planet, bountiful with Mako. Shinra sought to find this place and build their Neo Midgar on its soil, but as it turned out, the Promised Land wasn't a real place at all. In the OG, if you talk to Elder Hargo in Cosmo Canyon, he tells you his personal interpretation of the Promised Land. He says that it's the burial ground of the Cetra, though considering the inaccurate nature of the original translation, I wouldn't be surprised if the intention of these words is less literal and more spiritual. He continues to describe the Promised Land as a place of extreme happiness that is found when someone escapes their fate and finds peace. He then ends by saying that he doesn't know if it's true. I interpret his ideas like so. Those closely connected to the planet may find eternal tranquility if they find inner peace. A dream state of sorts, an interlude of optimism between life and nothingness where evil is absent and a warm light surrounds them. Whether literal or figurative is unclear. It also begs the question, if a Cetra doesn't find peace, will they find the Promised Land at all? Or will their experience in death be a much darker one? In Rebirth, there's another NPC in Cosmo Canyon that shares a spiritual theory. This time, it's about the life stream as it relates to life, hopes, and dreams.
And over the course of my studies, I stumbled across a fascinating theory. It addressed the issue of what the life stream is, arguing that spiritual energy is actually a manifestation of our knowledge and memories. Like I said, it's a fascinating theory, but it's incomplete. What about our hopes and dreams? We remember those, don't we? So what if spiritual energy doesn't distinguish between our real, lived memories and the unrealized desires buried deep in our hearts? What if coming into contact with that energy allowed us to peer through the looking glass, so to speak?
Then, just like Elder Hargo, she says that she doesn't know if it's true, but looks forward to learning the truth someday. She never mentions the Promised Land specifically, but I think the correlation here is extremely clear. She's describing a hypothetical spiritual experience where our memories, fears, hopes, and dreams become as real to our minds as our lives were. A place where what we dreamed is what we live. A place to remember and to let go. And she says all this within the context of contemplating a post-death experience. So, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling extremely confident that the alternate worlds we've been shown take place after death. And since the Promised Land is basically a post-death experience taking place inside the lifestream, I think you see where I'm going with this. I'm not saying all these sequences are literally glimpses into the Promised Land, but the thematic correlation is undeniably strong. Also, if the life stream is made of memories and dreams, could this mean that these worlds of wishful thinking are the dreams of characters we know? Perhaps we've seen Aerith dream of a world without pain, or Zack dream of a world without sacrifice. Maybe we've even seen a glimpse into Cloud's dream of a world without loss. When examining the multiple timelines presented in Rebirth, it's hard to fully parse what exactly is happening in every moment. But I can say one thing with confidence. The purpose of these metaphysical sequences is far more spiritual than anything found in Marvel movies, Back to the Future, or any other prominent story involving timelines or time travel. In the world of Final Fantasy VII, the lifestream has always been portrayed as a collection of memories, eternally bending with the ebb and flow of life. Even materia are simply memories and knowledge condensed into crystal. The multiple timelines, interludes, dreams, etc. that are presented in Remake and Rebirth, whether literal in some way or not, are clearly part of the lifestream. And when you consider how the portrayal of Zack and Aerith's respective interludes operate within the philosophical confines of the Promised Land, as explained by multiple Cosmo Canyon NPCs across 3 decades of game development, I think it's a solid bet that this is all building up to a powerfully spiritual climax at the end of Part 3, unlike anything experienced in the original. A thematic way of tying up decades of storytelling into an amalgamation of nostalgia and catharsis. I believe in its final moments, the third entry in the trilogy will leave us contemplating the finality of death, without forcing any unambiguous spiritual philosophies on us. Just like it was in 1997, the story of Final Fantasy VII is an exploration of coping with mortality, as told by humans who have all grappled with the shadow of death. Light versus dark, life versus death, optimism versus nihilism. It's a tale as old as time because despite all the innovation in humanity's history, we still don't understand what it really means to perceive reality. And as a result of that, we still don't know what it really means to return to the planet. Maybe we just turn off. Maybe we wake up and take off our VR headsets. Maybe we live the lives of every life that has ever been before being reborn as a god with unlimited knowledge. Or maybe we just spend an eternity sunbathing in the warm light of our most pleasant dreams.
I remember I am energy, not memory, not self. Everything else is pictures, picked up along the way. Fleeting little dreamlets printed on the tissue of my dying brain. And I'm returning. Just by remembering, I'm returning home. It's like a drop of water falling back into the ocean, of which it's always been a part. It's simply a dream that I think is my life every time. It's a wish. Made again and again and again and again and again and again and on into eternity. The cosmos and its infinite dream.